I'm going to review the rules again so that I know them and you know them, and I will try my best to follow them. Candidates for tonight's seat for 25B are Melissa Valeriano and Kim Norton. Each candidate will have 1 minute to offer an opening statement. The candidates will then respond to questions provided by the League of Women Voters Rochester, the Post Bulletin, and the Chamber of Commerce. Candidates will have 1 minute to answer each question. After each question is answered, you will have the opportunity to make a 30-second rebuttal. During the course of this evening, you may make 3 rebuttals, which is why you have 3 cards. You may rebut an answer 1 time per answer, but you each may rebut in each question. Got it?
You got
I would like to suggest,
We got it.
Yeah, okay. I would like to suggest that you make your answers as succinct as possible. Look at this last group. We went through 14 questions in 35 minutes. I think that was a record. It isn't necessary to take the entire minute. We would like to cover as many questions as possible. And I would like to remind the audience to remain quiet during the forum and to keep your electronic devices turned off. The candidates have drawn numbers to determine who is going to go first in their opening statements, and Ms. Valeriano will go first with her opening.
Yes, well, I haven't prepared anything, but I just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Melissa Valeriano. I am from Rochester since 1997. I have a 21-year-old son who just turned 21 on Sunday, graduated from John Marshall High School. In my career, I have worked in the mental health and disability services field for well over 15 years, and recently I went back to school as an adult learner to achieve my registered nurse status. I just became a registered nurse, and I am now working as a registered nurse in an inpatient psychiatric unit at a major hospital in Minnesota. I decided to run for the Minnesota House of Representatives because I see too many things happening in our state and our nation that very much concerns me, not only as a parent, but as a citizen myself. And especially in Minnesota, where we have such high tax rates, these things need to change. We can do a lot better. And coming from the healthcare field, I think I am in a prime position to help our healthcare status here in Minnesota. So I ask for your vote.
Thank you. Ms. Norton?
Good evening. I'm Kim Norton, and I'm running for re-election to the Minnesota House in District 25B. For the past 22 years, I've been an active community member, a volunteer, an advocate, and a public servant. I've worked in both the public and private sectors, and I've raised my 4 children in this community. I served 8 years on the Rochester School Board, including a year as chair, and I now serve in the legislature. I know my community, and I feel my moderate positions represent them well. The job of the legislature is to set sound policy and to use public dollars wisely, with an eye toward the future. Addressing our budget deficit with a balanced approach is essential to our state's success, and my experience is needed. Education and healthcare make up a majority of the state budget. I have a long and strong background in these areas. I've demonstrated that I can work across party lines to get good bills passed. I initially ran for office because I wanted to provide caring, responsible leadership with open communication, and I've done so. I continue to do what's best for my community and constituents, not strict ideology. I'm looking forward to the challenges ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. First question is offered by the League of Women Voters, and Ms. Norton will go with this. Will answer this question first. What 3 steps, if you have 3 steps, would you propose to balance the budget?
I don't know if I have exactly 3 steps, but in balancing the budget, the first thing we need to do is set our priorities. The budget reflects the priorities of this state. The second thing we need to do is look at our Constitution. What's in our Constitution, and what are we constitutionally mandated to budget for? And thirdly is to use a balanced approach that includes revenues, that includes reforms and efficiencies, as well as cuts. We're faced with a large budget deficit this coming year, and it's going to take creativity and innovation from the whole body of legislators in order to do that. And I'm willing to work across the aisle and work hard to get it done.
Thank you. Ms. Valeriano?
Yeah, I've thought about this question quite a few times in the last few years, and I think I'm not an expert on balancing budgets, but I am an expert on balancing my checkbook. And I know that when I don't have the money at the end of the month for things that I want and desire, I have to prioritize, big time. Prioritize what I need versus what I want. And I think we can do a lot better in the state of Minnesota on prioritizing our spending. Number two, efficiency. They've started working on this in the last legislative session as far as streamlining. They talked about it in the last talk with the efficiencies and streamlining government, utilizing technology to streamline a lot of the processes that we have in state government. Another thing that we can do also is reduce redundancies. There's a lot of redundancies out there that we can reduce. And reducing the redundancies and making sure that we're not doing the same things over and over and over again will help to increase what we have coming in as far as our revenues.
Thank you. Any rebuttal? All right, our next question from the League of Women Voters, and we will begin with Ms. Norton. If the proposed constitutional amendment requiring all voters to show a photo or show a photo ID before voting passes in November, what rules would you propose in order to implement the language of the amendment in 2013?
Well, therein lies the issue with voter ID. We don't have any of that figured out yet. If it does pass, we have some challenges. I think one of the first things we need to do is look at what do we mean by government-issued photo ID. We need to make certain that we make provisions for seniors who don't have driver's licenses and others, the disabled, people that don't have birth certificates. We have to make an easy, streamlined process for them to be able to get it, and to get it with this ID, and to get it without a fee. Because again, there's constitutionally, we cannot have a poll tax. So I think we need to do that. We also need to make certain that our overseas voters and our military voters have a process that is fair to them, as well as dealing with students. One of the biggest issues that's come forward to date has been students at colleges who may be living away from home, whose ID may reflect a different address than the place they're going to vote. And we just absolutely have to have correct language in law to deal with those situations.
Thank you, Ms. Valeriano.
And I think, a lot of those things have been looked at, and a lot of those things have been addressed. And what we have to look at really is the cost of recounts. In the last election in 2008, the recount cost Minnesota $460,000. What we also have to look at is the number of votes that a major U.S. Senate race was decided by. Merely 312 votes decided that Senate race. As far as the rules that we would propose to ensure that all voters can vote, a lot of those things, again, have been looked at. We are not actually going to be disenfranchising as many people as the argument has been pushed forward. A lot of the disenfranchised arguments come from numbers that greatly exceed the amount of voters that actually exist. So those actual arguments are pretty fraudulent, and I think we've already proven that.
Any rebuttal?
I would like to rebut this. A nonprofit organization of the Twin Cities did research on this very issue, and what they found was that up to 13% of citizens in the state to date, if we put this into law today, would not be able to vote on the polling. These are legitimate citizens who are allowed to vote. We would be disenfranchising them or perhaps disallowing their vote. So this is a real issue, and we need to deal with it in an appropriate way. We can't just push it under the rug and pretend that it doesn't exist. There is no voter ID, voter fraud in the state of Minnesota. Perhaps other frauds, but not ID.
Thank
One
you.
more
Rebuttal?
rebuttal? So far, about 10,000 licenses have been canceled by vehicle services. They're still working on canceling about 13,000 more licenses. These are fraudulent licenses. These have not been checked against the welfare rolls or the voter rolls. You're saying that we don't have voter fraud, yet we don't know yet how much fraud is actually out there. And as a matter of fact, one person in the Secretary of State's office is being charged right now with fraud, using a fraudulent license. We don't know, and it has been proven that she's already used that fraudulent ID to vote.
Thank you. Our next question comes from the Post Bulletin, and we'll begin with Ms. Valeriano.
The state still owes K-12 schools about $2 billion in deferred payments. What do you think the timeline should be for paying that back, and where should the funding come from to do that?
They had a chance to pay it back in this last legislative session. Revenue exceeded expectations. From a $6.2 billion projected deficit, the last legislative session actually found revenue actually ended up in a surplus. There was a bill put forward to pay back some of this education shift money. And unfortunately, my opponent voted nay on that, and the governor vetoed it anyways. We already had a chance to start paying this back. Unfortunately, people in our last legislature, some of them didn't agree and voted not to pay it back. I find that troubling. For people to say that they are educationally focused and yet vote to borrow money from the schools, and then when there's a chance to pay that money back, vote against paying it back, I find that very troubling. I would have voted to pay it back with that opportunity.
Ms. Norton?
Certainly. We do have a $2.4 billion borrowing scheme that was put in place. We do have to pay it back, and I'm going to suggest that we do it as quickly as possible. I don't have a year timeline for you, but it needs to be done quickly. And unfortunately, this is something that's been done historically in a small way, but this large amount has never been borrowed before. It's going to be a challenge for the state revenue to do it. While I did vote against a proposal to pay it back, it was one that used reserves and cash flow money that had been agreed upon in advance to be put back in those pots in order to not hurt our credit rating, our bonding ratings any further than they had already been hurt. We've already been lowered in by all three houses, Moody's and the rest of them. We've already had that credit rating lowered because of the way we were mismanaging the budget, and that could not happen again. So the governor did the wise thing by protecting it. What my opponent doesn't seem to understand is that I actually authored a bill that would have paid back the school shift using real revenue, which is what we have to do this year.
Any rebuttal?
Yeah, I will just say that there was real revenue. There was a surplus of real revenue that came in. And with that surplus, we could have started paying back this shift. I would have voted to pay it back. We had enough in the reserve funds to pay for the disasters, monies that Duluth needed after the flooding. That was in there. So I don't see the problem with paying back education, important piece of legislation that should have started in this last legislative session. I would have voted to pay it back.
Further rebuttal? Our next question from the Post Bulletin will begin with Ms. Norton.
Last session, the City of Rochester's #1 priority was getting state funding to expand Mayo Civic Center to add convention space. If elected or re-elected, would you support these efforts? Why or why not?
I absolutely would support the Civic Center. I supported it this past year and worked with city leaders and business leaders in this community to make that happen. The situation that occurred in the House was that some members from our own Rochester area refused to carry the bill and get behind it, and the bonding chair in the House said, if your own legislators will not get behind this project, it's not going to be in our bill. And that started the whole tumble-down effect that we had. It's very unfortunate. The business case was made. It was made solidly by the business leaders, by the Chamber of Commerce, by our city, that this would not only be good for the city of Rochester as a whole, as a regional center, but it also would bring revenue, much needed revenue, into our downtown communities that right now have Mayo business during the weekdays, but are struggling on the weekends to fill those rooms, which the convention center does on occasion, but would do in a much more effective way if it were larger and could take the size of conventions that we actually need in this community.
Ms. Valeriano?
When you're running at a deficit, sometimes you do have to prioritize projects. Unfortunately, important projects like the Civic Center come under the realm of having to be prioritized. DEED was given a list of criteria to evaluate projects that counties and cities all over the state wanted to implement. The criteria were very firm and solid criteria. Unfortunately, DEED passed that along to Governor Dayton to have the last say on what projects in the state of Minnesota would be funded. And unfortunately, the Civic Center project fell off the map once it was given to Governor Dayton. What I say is, with great amounts of money come great responsibilities. One of the things that I was concerned with when I was learning about this project was the lack of upkeep that our current Civic Center experienced. And
Okay.
Rebecca.
Sure. It is the legislature's job to build a bonding bill every other year in the state of Minnesota. It was our job, and it was our responsibility, and as a legislator representing this area, it is my job to argue that our projects are worth putting in that bonding bill. The DEED grant fund was I call it a Hail Mary effort because legislators didn't do their job. Not only do we need a bonding bill in the state, it must be statewide and not just projects in the Twin Cities, which has happened far too often.
Final word on
I gotta say that I only have one.
it? Okay. All right, our next question comes from the Chamber of Commerce. We'll begin with Ms. Norton again.
In the upcoming session, the legislature will work on tax reform. What would you propose to make Minnesota better able to attract and retain businesses?
Thank you. I've been a long supporter of tax reform. There are many committees that have actually been formed in my 6 years at the legislature about what can we do to make our system more fair, easier to understand, simplified. One of the things we can do is broaden the base of our sales tax and lower the rate. That's a suggestion that came out of both the Governor Plenty's tax reform committee and the statewide one that was put into place. In order to make businesses want to come to Minnesota, we can lower the tax rate. We have a reasonable effective tax rate, but that isn't what the first thing people look at when they come to our state. They see the tax rate on record, and it is high, and I have proposed lowering the corporate tax rate, but we're removing some of the perhaps incentives that could actually be done cost neutral if we really wanted to do this. Minnesota does quite well in the recent year in bringing small businesses to Minnesota, and I'm not sure if you're aware, but we are on target for a record number of small businesses starting in the state of Minnesota in 2012.
I have a lot to say about this, so I'm going to go fast. Minnesota ranks 45th in the nation as far as our state business tax climate. This is 3 years running. That means that we are in the bottom of all of the states, top 10 bottom of our business tax climate. We have a 5.8% unemployment rate, 2 percentage points lower than the federal rate. However, when you flesh that out, another 6.3% of that, additional to that, is underemployed people. We have a very large percentage of part-time employment here in Minnesota, and these are mostly service industry jobs. We have many companies that are laying off. We've got St. Jude Medical, we've got General Mills, we've got Medtronic, we've got a 2.3 excise tax that's coming on top of all of the other taxes that Minnesota businesses pay that will cost Minnesota about $5 to $8 billion annually. This is in the new Affordable Care Act, which my opponent has supported. She failed to stop that, and she also voted against repealing business property taxes in the last legislative session.
Any rebuttals? All right, thank you. Next question from the Chamber of Commerce. We'll begin with Ms. Valeriano.
What will be your top priority if you were elected or re-elected?
Oh, it's mine?
Yes.
The number one thing, because of the hard deadlines that we have to meet, and I'm coming from a healthcare industry standpoint, is we really have to look at this Affordable Care Act. It's not affordable. It's a big, massive tax. It is now over $2 trillion projected to cost, and this is from the CBO, actually. It's a massive new tax, $2.6 trillion in its first decade, 2.3% excise tax on medical device companies. This is greatly going to harm Minnesota because that's one of our leading industries, medical device industry. It's going to directly affect 735,000 workers, indirectly affect 160,000 workers. I think this is a number one thing that we have to deal with. There was a bill that was on the floor that, again, my opponent did not support. It was called the Freedom of Choice in Healthcare Act that did not pass, and that would have allowed us to opt out of this tax.
Ms. Norton?
Could I have a question asked?
Repeated?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
What will be your top priority if you are reelected?
Thank you. Well, the legislature's top priority must be balancing the budget this year. We have been doing short-term fixes. We have not balanced the budget and taken care of the structural problems that are inherent since the Jesse Ventura days. I would continue to work on K-12 reform and lowering higher education tuition, trying to keep those costs down, because what we need in this state is a strong workforce. In order to get that, they need to have the strong education system underpinning for it. And we have not at the state level been doing what we should do in order to have that type of workforce in front of us. We need to work on the business climate. As I said, I'm interested in working certainly across the aisle on the business climate. And I'd like to remind my opponent that I have nothing to do with the medical device component of the ACA. I don't support it, and I will work to see with our federal legislators to see that it's repealed or changed so that it doesn't harm Minnesota's strong medical device industry.
Any rebuttal?
I'll just rebut on this one because you supported the Affordable Care Act. You actually signed an amicus brief to the Supreme Court of the United States of America urging them to pass this tax as constitutional. And we know it's a tax. That's what SCOTUS has told us. It's a tax. So you urged SCOTUS to find it constitutional. I don't see how that protects Minnesota companies that don't need another 2.3% tax added on when we have the 45th worst business tax climate in the nation.
Any further rebuttal?
Yeah, I have two. Thank you. I did, in fact, sign an amicus brief urging the federal courts to find the bill constitutional. That doesn't mean I approve every component of it. As you find out in the legislature, you approve something one year, it's not right, you go back to the table and you fix it. That's our job as legislators. My amicus brief support was to find it, the urge to the judge to find it constitutional, and had absolutely nothing to do with that particular component.
Thank you. Well, that is it on our rebuttals. Our next question from the audience. We begin with Ms. Norton. Water and air are important natural resources in Minnesota. They provide jobs and are good for our economy. But sand fracking proposals also affect our water and air. What is your view on the sand fracking?
Thank you. Water and air certainly are important, particularly in a state like Minnesota where we have so much water and we need to keep it clean. I have an excellent record, probably the best record I have at the Capitol is on environmental issues. Sand fracking is not something I spent a lot of time. We haven't talked about it. It's a newer issue that really hit its peak after the legislative session. But as I've been reading up on it, it seems clear that we have two components to deal with. One is the safety of the environment and the individuals that live and might be affected by the silica sand in the air. And the second is making certain that we don't harm an industry that really could thrive in our state, particularly in this particular region that has a lot of silica sand in the quarries. So I think what we need to do is look at the pilot programs that have been started this year. I was very pleased to see some of the counties administer pilots. We'll look at those, we'll look at the results and have the state do what it can do, studying the issue, and then we'll bring it to the table and discuss it in the legislature.
Thank you, Ms. Valeriano.
I too am not an expert in frac sanding. It hasn't been in my resume, but it is a hot debate environmentally. And the one thing, philosophically speaking, that I would agree with is that we've got to keep this issue as local as possible. You know, once you start sending it off further and further and further away from the locations that are actually affected by it, the decision-making becomes a lot less relevant to the people and the citizens that it's going to affect directly. It is a great resource in Minnesota. We have some of the largest silica sand mines in the nation, and I think using this resource is a great revenue source for Minnesota. Again, though EPA standards will have to be met, and the EPA, I know, will be sure of that, but it will bring us closer to energy independence, and I think that as a nation is what we're really striving to do. We need to become energy independent, and if this is going to be one component of energy independence, I think we need to use our resources and become a leader in the nation for this.
Thank you. Our next question from the audience will begin with Ms. Norton again. Are public safety issues such as cell phone usage while driving, motorcycle helmet usage, limits on teen driving, etc., necessary or are they unnecessary restrictions on individuals?
Thank you. One of the biggest issues we have at the Capitol when we deal with public safety and other healthcare, many issues, is finding that balance between what's the right thing to do for the community and what infringes on a person's personal rights. I did actually carry and pass the teen graduated driver's license as having saved lives, which I'm very pleased about these past few years. I signed on to a helmet bill which gave motorcycle riders the choice to wear a helmet or not wear a helmet. The CDC says it's a huge issue that non-helmet use is causing many deaths in our state and across the nation. The bill I supported gave those riders the choice, which I think was nice. Cell phone use, I have many, many constituents who have been calling. I meet them day to day outdoor knocking who really would like cell phones banned in the cars. I have thus far only supported a hands-free cell phone bill, but I'm certainly interested in seeing the data from CDC and others on this.
Ms. Valeriano?
The one thing that we have to decide locally, statewide, nationwide is, as citizens, we have to choose between big government, nanny state, and individual freedom. But what we never talk about when we talk about rights is the responsibilities that come with having all those freedoms. Our responsibilities as free citizens are to make sure that we're doing things and we're responsible for the actions that we take. We have legislators, we have governors in other states who are banning large soda pops. What's the next thing that we're going to ban? I know the Minnesota Association of Motorcyclists and Bikers are completely opposed to the helmet laws that my opponent has championed. They propose and strongly encourage education, absolutely. But you gotta think about what's going to be next. Are the legislators putting themselves up on this pedestal and saying, tisk, tisk, we know what's best for you, or are we going to allow people to make their own decisions in life?
Thank you. Our next question from the audience will be offered to Ms. Valeriano first. What would you do to reduce welfare fraud and abuse?
Okay, with the welfare fraud and abuse, we know that exists as well. We have a lot of fraud that's occurring, and we know this by all of the Department of Motor Vehicles with all the licenses that are being revoked, and we know that a lot of those are being used to get fraudulent entitlements. I think what we need to do is, number one, and this will be starting in 2013 hopefully, but we need to start looking at all of those records and those databases and comparing them to welfare and entitlement rolls to make sure that there are people receiving entitlements who deserve and are eligible for the entitlements and not fraudulently receiving those entitlements. The other thing is, I don't think that we should be increasing dependency. I don't think we should be expanding the roles and expanding the definitions of what makes a person eligible for an entitlement. I work in the healthcare field. I've seen this happen over the last couple of decades where we expand the definition so that everybody becomes eligible.
Thank you, Ms. Norton.
Sure. I'm not going to stand here and tell you that welfare fraud doesn't occur. Of course it does, but it's minuscule. The welfare budget in the state is minuscule, and yet this emotional issue keeps being brought up year after year after year, and we hear bill after bill after bill. We pass many of those bills. You know, we can keep coming up with ideas and put them into law, or we can spend our time and energy on real healthcare reform. Let me just say, the abuse you're seeing, it's not, the big abuse isn't from welfare recipients. The abuse they find in the system is actually from providers. It is people billing the system inappropriately. Florida has saved millions of dollars by going after providers who are billing inappropriately. That's where the fraud is. So it just makes people feel good, I think, to get all in a lather about the poor welfare mom who may buy cigarettes instead of apples. Well, I want that mom to buy apples too. Personal responsibility, as we said, comes into play here.
I wish I had a rebuttal.
Thank you. Our next question from the audience on a different subject. We'll go to Ms. Norton first. What can the state do to find long-term solutions to decrease homelessness in Minnesota?
Wow. Well, one of the things the state has done in the past to decrease homelessness is support programs both in the Twin Cities and actually down here. They fund some grants for some wonderful organizations. Can't think of the full name of it, that does a really nice job actually going out and finding our homeless and providing apartments, helping them get settled. I visited some of their facilities and we were talking about men who couldn't even get on a bed because they hadn't slept on a bed for so long. Teen homelessness is another issue, and I think a lot of the solution, while the state can provide grants and funding, a lot of those solutions have to come from here. They have to come from our community who knows these individuals, who know where they live, who can care for them in the most appropriate manner. So I'm fine with grants, but I really do think that's more of a local issue.
Ms. Valeriano?
I'm passionate about this issue. I actually participate in Project Homeless Connect. It's a project that's predominantly up in the Twin Cities metro area. It occurs at the Minneapolis Convention Center, and it brings together multiple and numerous services under one roof. It's a one-stop shop twice a year for homeless people in the area up there. I think it's a brilliant idea. I think I worked for charities that one of their problems was all of the donations that they were receiving were too much. I mean, they had so many donations coming in that they didn't have room for these donations. The thing is, the long-term solutions, I truly believe that homeless shelters are part of our infrastructure, and because of that, I believe that it is our responsibility as a state to make sure that this infrastructure is kept up, maintained, and that we have the resources necessary for those people who, for no fault of their own, find themselves on the streets.
Thank you. Our next question has to do with education and the voucher system. We will begin with Ms. Valeriano. What effect do charter schools and vouchers have on educational resources in Minnesota? And what is the responsibility of the legislature?
I absolutely love the charter system. I think we have to look at expanding it and encourage more of its use. I try not to bash education, but it's no secret that in Rochester alone, last year, almost 20% of our students needed waivers to graduate. Up in Minneapolis, it was even worse. Almost 40% of the students needed waivers to graduate. Even as more and more money has been appropriated to K through 12 education. We also have an increased number of freshmen taking remedial classes once they enter college. This shouldn't be happening. They're spending a lot of money on remedial education that first year in college, where you're talking about a lot of debt that students have when they get out of college. Well, part of that debt, a big part of that debt, is the remedial courses that they have to take, which cost a lot of money. They shouldn't have to be taking these. I think charter schools do a great job in really focusing to the needs of the students. They teach to the students, and they don't have to go by a one-size-fits-all curriculum.
Thank you, Ms. Martin.
Yes, I do not support vouchers, and I have limited support for charter schools. There are some excellent charter schools, and I'm willing to support those that have lived up to the expectations the state put in front of them, which are doing things differently and doing it better. And if they do, I'm more than willing to support them. What we have found, however, is that there was a broad and fast expansion of charter schools. The results of the testing showed that charter schools failed to make AYP at twice the average of regular schools in the system. And there are many reasons for that, and I'm willing to listen to them. But what we need in the legislature is to put in place something that doesn't just automatically expand the charter system, but holds them accountable and up to the same high standards we expect all our schools to be held to. I don't disagree with anything my opponent said about remediation. It's something, I serve on the higher ed and K-12 committees, it's something we discuss regularly. We're open to new ideas, the ELL students are a particular challenge, as she mentioned, and that's the cause for some of those high numbers. We definitely need to deal with that.
Thank you. I'm going to squeeze in one more question, though it's not a small one. We're going to begin with Ms. Valeriano. Healthcare research is very important to our community. How can you work in the legislature to assure that possible legislation does not limit research or move it out of Minnesota?
I thought I was going to be second on this one. Healthcare research, actually, when they argue about the need for, I think what you're talking about is embryonic stem cell research. When they talk about the need for that, we already know technology is moving forward so fast in this field. There are so many projects going on all over the nation, and in the world, in fact, that has proven that you don't need embryonic stem cells to produce the results that they have seen in places like, Hong Kong. They don't have any limitations or regulations on that or restrictions on that. But we have been able to reproduce these studies and the multiplication of the genetic components in cells without using embryonic stem cells. So if we don't have to use them, why should we be using them? The research, again, University of Minnesota is one of the top and leading institutions in the nation for a lot of this scientific research that's moving forward. I don't think the loss of some of these embryonic stem cells is going to reduce their progress.
Ms. Norton?
Thank you. Well, I'll start with just generically research, and it's important in the state, and it is very important for the University of Minnesota and Mayo Clinic. In fact, many of us in Rochester have carried legislation to support the Genomics Partnership, which is a partnership between the University of Minnesota and Mayo Clinic in order to utilize the skills in both those organizations to move research forward. As far as stem cell research, the University of Minnesota is a research institution. The last president had moving us to the top across the nation as a research university as a goal. We have had to fight against cuts to research at the University of Minnesota almost every year since I've been there, not just to the Genomics Partnership, but to research, which keeps getting cut year after year at the University of Minnesota. It is important. But with stem cell, the University of Minnesota comes and sits at our tables and tells us, yes, there are advances being made, but there are still things you can do with stem cells that they want to do, that they're asking us to do, in addition to the other advances. There are particular things, and they do support it.
Thank you. And for closing statements tonight, Ms. Valeriano will second. Ms. Norton will go first.
We all know the coming session will be a challenge, but one I'm ready and prepared to face on your behalf. Nobody knows yet who will be in charge, so having someone who can work across the aisle rather than espouse rigid ideology will be an asset. I have the experience and the bipartisan reputation to do this work. With a balanced approach to handling the deficit and some good statewide capital investments, Minnesota will continue a strong recovery with positive growth, and Rochester can be ready to support these efforts in southern Minnesota. Through smart investments and policy decisions focused on quality pre-K through 12 education, affordable college that meets workforce needs, a strong jobs climate, a healthcare system which addresses our growing elderly population, and a safety net for vulnerable Minnesotans, we can thrive post-recession. I will continue my commitment to open communication and listening to your needs and concerns as these solutions are being negotiated. My practical common sense approach and bipartisan reputation will be needed in the halls of the Capitol. I'm asking you to place your trust in me and vote for me on November 6th.
Thank you. Ms. Valeriano?
Wow, now I wish I would have prepared something. I just wanted to thank everybody for your time, your devotion to the political process, and this welcoming atmosphere. I was a little nervous, but this has been wonderful. I've learned a lot, and I really do like Kim Norton. We've met outside of politics, and I think she's a wonderful lady. We just happen to disagree completely when it comes to our philosophies on making this state a wonderful and job-rich state. I am not for increasing dependency on government. I'm all for increasing jobs in Minnesota, and instead of handing people a check, a welfare check once a month, I would rather people have so many jobs to choose from, and good jobs, not just service industry jobs, but jobs with benefits that can motivate them for the future, that can make them feel really good about having a career and having a job that they can put their own food on the table for their dependents. I'm ready to fight for this in Minnesota, and I believe that I'm fully ready to take on this task.
Thank you, candidates. I would like to thank each of you for participating in tonight's forum. Thank you for your service to the community. Thank you for your willingness to participate in the democratic process by running for office, by coming to places like this. I'd like to remind all of you in the audience that the views expressed in the forums tonight were those of the candidates and not those of the League of Women Voters or any partner or sponsor in this forum. Thank you all for coming tonight, especially tonight when there was so much competition for your attention. Thanks to our partners, the Rochester Area Chamber of Commerce, the Rochester Post Bulletin, the Rochester and RCTC, our supporting sponsors. We thank you too. I would like to remind all of you that absentee voting for residents in Olmsted County, it has been moved to the Olmsted County Fairgrounds at 1421 3rd Avenue, which is just opposite Woodruff's Plumbing. Election day is November 6th, so please remember to vote.